Hello and welcome to this first part of a lecture on the acts and responsibilities of artificial intelligence. My name is Antonia Waltermann. I'm an assistant professor of legal theory at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. This is the first part of a two-part lecture, but it's also the third lecture in a small series of lectures called it For the Recognized Project. If you haven't already done so, I recommend watching the other two lectures in this three-part lecture series first. The plan for this lecture and this first part of the lecture is to have a look at the question that we're talking about, talk a little bit about the reasons why we even need to talk about acts and responsibility of artificial intelligence, and also to have a first look at part of the argument. Now, what is it that we're going to talk about in this lecture? It makes sense for us to get that straight first and foremost. Part of what I will be talking about in the lecture is agency. And when I talk about an agent, I really mean any entity capable of acting in a sense that is relevant for responsibility. There is a lot of thought, a lot of philosophy behind that. Some of that we will dive into, most of that we will not be diving into in this lecture. And there is also, if you're coming from law, the law of agency, which essentially means that an entity can act as a representative of sorts for another person. That is not what I have in mind here when I talk about an agent. I mean it in the more general sense of that anyone capable of acting in the sense that is relevant for responsibility is an agent for the purposes of this lecture. When we're talking about responsibility, that can be legal responsibility or liability. It can be moral responsibility as well. Also there's a lot of philosophical thought. There are very different theories. Most of that we will not be diving into. For the purposes of this lecture, it suffices that someone who is responsible may be praiseworthy or blameworthy, depending on whether it is good or a bad act, may be liable to pay or may be liable to sanctions if we're talking about legal responsibility or liability. And lastly, when I talk about artificial intelligence, what I am talking about there is a system displaying intelligent behavior in the sense that it analyzes its environment, takes actions, and portrays some degree of autonomy. Now, artificial intelligence and these kinds of systems that interact and analyze with their environment can be purely digital, so they can be purely algorithmic, or they can be somehow physically embedded. Sort of there you might be thinking of drones or robots. They could then analyze, for example, the environment, the physical environment by means of a camera, but environment can also be a digital environment, so it need not necessarily be a physically embedded robot. It can also be a purely digital algorithm. Why do we need to talk about responsibility and possible agency of artificial intelligence? The main reason I think why we need to talk about it, or one of the main reasons why we need to talk about it, is the fact that there may be a potential liability gap in the law. And what I mean by that is that currently existing regimes of liability, be that in private law, so it could be contractual liability, it could be liability in tort law, but it could also be criminal liability. But current liability regimes that we have in the law, and here I make no distinction between jurisdictions, I think this at the time holds quite generally, although there are, of course, initiatives. The European Union, for example, is working on this very much to change that. But currently, our liability regimes may not cover some cases where artificial intelligence is causally responsible for certain actions or certain types of damages, and where in particular it also seems unfair to hold, for example, the programmer liable for actions, causal actions by an algorithm. And this is predominantly due to self-learning algorithms and increased autonomy of those algorithms, where it is impossible, let's say impossible, sometimes very difficult, but sometimes actually impossible for us to predict what the outcome will be, what actions will be. So it is not only unforeseen at times, but also unforeseeable what the damage will be, or that damage will occur. And particularly where foreseeability is a requirement, where we're not talking, for example, about strict liability regimes that may make liability actually impossible for programmers or users of an algorithm, depending on the specifics of the rules. But even where it is possible, it may seem unfair to hold someone who could not have foreseen or should not have foreseen that damage would occur liable for that damage. So in those cases, given that much of AI as it currently stands is what we consider a black box algorithm, in the sense that we do not know what is going on within the algorithm or how it learns. Given this, there are potential liability gaps in the law. Some currently exist, some that will arise as technology also changes. So because of all of this, because of these potential liability gaps, I think it is necessary to talk about the question whether or not we can and whether or not we should hold AI systems liable themselves in the law. So then we're not talking about liability of a user, we're not talking about liability of a programmer, but rather the question is, can the law hold the artificially intelligent system itself liable, and should it do so? So those are the two questions that this lecture deals with. When it comes to the question of whether a law can hold AI systems, or for that matter, any other kind of entity liable, we can conceive of possible answers along a spectrum. And that is a spectrum from, on the one hand, more permissivist towards more restrictivist approaches. Restrictivism, so one end of the spectrum, denies the possibility of holding autonomous machines liable, legally responsible, on essentially metaphysical grounds, whereas permissivist, so the permissivist end of the spectrum, imposes essentially no restrictions whatsoever. If the law says someone's liable or something is liable, then that someone or something is liable. So there's no limit on what legal constructions are possible. Essentially, if it's in the law, then that's what it is. The restrictivist argument imposes limits. It says not anything goes in the law, but there are limits to the legal constructions that are possible in the law. And they make that argument on the basis of metaphysical grounds. So they say, okay, but legal agency and responsibility are not just questions of, oh, the law says you're responsible and therefore you're responsible, but rather the law can only say that you're responsible when you meet certain characteristics, when you meet certain metaphysical characteristics in particular. Candidates for these kinds of metaphysical characteristics, these metaphysical grounds are, for example, consciousness, intentionality, the capacity for intentional action, free will, particularly in the libertarian sense, and here I mean libertarian not as a political philosophy, autonomy, but also capacity for deliberation, etc. So these are the kind of metaphysical characteristics that you may need to meet in order for a restrictivist argument to hold that the law can hold you liable. The argument in that sense goes essentially as follows. An entity that lacks certain characteristics cannot be legally responsible. Artificial intelligence, so the argument goes, lacks those characteristics. Therefore, artificial intelligence cannot be legally responsible. Against this argument, we might hold the view from some legal theory. There are also debates on this in legal theory, very much so. But here I want to highlight one particular argument, just the argument that law is a conventional tool, that law is something that we as human beings create. And if that is the case, if we make it, then we have some control over how we make it and what we do with it as well. If that argument holds, if you agree with me on this point, then the more restrictivist argument that the law cannot do something, that the law cannot hold artificial intelligence liable because artificial intelligence lacks certain metaphysical requirements, if that is indeed the case, but I think that argument can be made. That argument that this is impossible for the law does not hold if we can make the law in any way, shape, or form that we want. And I think that there are good reasons to assume that that is the case. This is a relatively positivist picture of law, by the way. If you're a non-positivist, I think the argument still holds, but then the argument holds for positive law. And that is an entirely different discussion that we will not be entering in this lecture, though. Essentially, then, what we've done so far is look at whether or not it is possible, theoretically possible, for the law to hold artificial intelligence liable. We're not looking at whether the law currently does this. We're only looking at the question whether or not law can do so. And there, I think if we were to change the rules, or rather if legislators were to change the rules accordingly, then yes, this could be done. The next question, of course, is then whether it should be done. But that is a question that we will turn to after the break. Thank you very much.